Right. Good afternoon, everybody. People are still joining, but I'll get some of the logistics out of the way, and then we will dive right into the governing document draft. So thank you all for joining the task force meeting today to discuss the draft phase 3 governing document. I am recording this meeting like we typically do, and the recording will be made available for those of that were unable to join us, or if you need to go back and take a look at something if you want to do that later. So we'll post where the video can be accessed later. Probably not going to sing a holiday chorus at the moment, but maybe if we end early, we'll do a little bit of holiday caroling or Rushi. I'm looking in the comments, and that takes me to the next logistical thing. If you have something you want folks to see, please drop it in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand using the raise hand button like I just did. And as people raise their hand, we will look to pause at the appropriate time and address the hands as they are raised. If somebody asks your question and you have your hand raised and you no longer need to ask your question, just lower your hand and we'll move on to the folks after that. So since we're talking about the structure of the marketplace, I think it's also a good meeting to remind ourselves of what the task force charter says as it relates to antitrust compliance. So let me go through that real quick. Section 4 of the task force charter provides that the following. The commission strictly prohibits members of the task force and their employees and other entities or persons that may participate in task force activities from using their participation in task force activities as a forum for engaging in practices or communications that violate applicable antitrust laws. So as we always do, task force members and their organizations and others participating today are reminded to act in full compliance with state and federal antitrust laws, and will continue to maintain the highest ethical standards in the way that we operate ourselves today. So with that, unless there are any other administrative items, the one agenda item we have for today is extremely important, and that's to look at the phase 3 governing document draft. And let me pause before I turn it over to Ryan at ERCOT to see if there are any other logistical or administrative items we need to cover before we dive in. All right. Ryan, if you want to share the document, I know task force members have been able to take a look at it. You may not have everybody's comments in the document you've got just for technical reasons. Some folks were unable to get their comments put into that document, so we may have some that we hear live as we go. But I'll stop and turn it over to you, Ryan.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ryan King with ERCOT. Maybe I'll just make sure that people are seeing the phase 3 governing document on the screen.
We can see it.
Excellent. Okay, first hurdle cleared. Well, thank you very much. The purpose of today is I really wanted to cover 3 things. We wanted to recap by going through this governing document, essentially the scope of changes that we have proposed as part of phase 3 of the ADR pilot. These are themes that we've discussed at a few task force presentations, but we hadn't had the chance to codify, if you like, these into the governing document. So this is meant to be an interactive session. I'm pleased to see that we've already seen some comments in the form of red lines to this document. I'm happy to stop at any time if through multitasking I miss a question, please point me towards it. But my intent will probably not be to go through each piece line by line, but what I will do along with Mark Patterson is to focus on the sections that have the change, explain what we've been doing here, answer any questions, and then look to provide feedback. Just a note that what we have done here is similar to the approach that we took for phase 2, and that is that we took the existing governing document, and phase 3 is effectively red lines that effectuate what we're proposing to do for this document. Please disregard the future approval. Obviously, we can't bind that. That was more a notional date, but it will be dependent, of course, on getting the feedback and coming to some final consensus before we bring this to TAC and the board. All right, so I am just going to start scrolling here before I get to some of the main changes. So in the introduction, as I mentioned, we have some sort of placeholder languages that really will be filled in as we advance this governing document forward. But we do have a summary of the 3 areas where we've had the most significant change as part of phase 3 of this document. So the first one is this concept that we've talked about previously, and the idea is to incorporate a new participation framework for ADERs, and that's by using the non-controllable load resource, or NCLR, participation model. And what this would allow is aggregations of sites that may not be able to follow SCED base points, so may not be able to follow those linear 5-minute ramp instructions, but what this would enable is aggregations of load or aggregations of load and generation to be able to participate as an aggregated DER and to offer ancillary services in accordance with the ones that have been approved for this pilot, which is ERCOT contingency reserve service and non-spinning reserve service. Other clarifications that we've noted here is that we did mention this last time. We felt that the current document could reflect with a bit more clarity the fact that when we review DOTA forms, we do look for whether a resource has participated in ERCOT's emergency response service program, but we don't necessarily have the same transparency into transmission or TDU commercial and residential load management programs. So we've, I believe that was in there before, but we've just kind of clarified it and made clear that this is something that would need to be done by TDUs as part of their review of the DOTA process. And finally, we do have some updates and clarifications to the processes for premise level validation. Again, this is based on seeing some premise level items and seeing that there's an opportunity to clarify things. Looks like we have a question, so maybe I'll pause there before going into the meat of the document.
Thanks for being acknowledged. I realize I'm catching it, right after the preamble here, but in phase 2, we had the interest in exploring RRS, and I don't think we ever got there. I was wondering if it could be carried over to phase 3, and I apologize for not including this in formal comments, but I'll try to do so after the meeting.
Well, certainly we're happy to discuss this. I think if we want to just step back, the impetus for a lot of these changes was I think the memo that Commissioner Glotfeldt had put forward, and this was really about trying to expand participation. And I think based on the discussions that we've had with external stakeholders internally as well, this seemed to be the most bang for the buck in terms of what we would prioritize. And that's not to say that we wouldn't do other things, but I think this is, if we want to be in a position where we want to have this approved and ready to go in sort of Q1, this would kind of be the scope for this. But I don't think that's meant to necessarily exclude anything at this point. I see Dave has his hands up. Maybe he wanted to add something on this.
Yeah, Ryan. I guess the only thing I was going to add on top of what you said is the specific language that we had in there for phase 2 of exploring that, Greg, is remaining. So there's still flexibility to continue talking about that particular item, even if it's not necessarily carved out as an explicit participation model for phase 3. So that language that we added to explore that, and maybe it's down a little bit further in the purpose. I forget exactly where it is in the document. But that remains an item to be explored in phase 3 as well.
I appreciate that call out and your feedback as well, Ryan. And I'm a big fan of what you've done to expand this to NCLRs. And I think in terms of expanding participation, NCLRs that can provide frequency response is a big group that is yet to be incorporated, as is those resources that can participate with frequency response and a SCED dispatch. It's just a minimally intrusive use case for distributed storage and any other, frankly, resource that's using an inverter to charge. So, think vehicular fleets and, centralized chargers as well.
Okay, is there another question? I believe there is. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Rajiv
Chief.
Shah, Octopus Energy Group. Just a question for Greg, sort of, have you guys done any modeling or kind of back of the envelope, even sort of consideration of how much value PFR could be sort of providing to certain resources in the market right now? I guess like in order to kind of better understand what the additive benefit would be, because we're definitely interested in ways to bring more value from DERs to the table through ADER processes. Just be curious, kind of sort of some of the underpinnings of that. And Greg, apologies if I missed it in sort of previous commentary or filings you guys have sort of shared on this topic.
No, I appreciate the question. If it's okay with the chair, I'll just respond to it quickly.
I'm not the chair, but it's okay with me.
That's fine.
Go ahead.
Yes, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I just didn't want to speak out of turn. I saw some other hands up. Yeah, real quickly, I won't opine on the future value of primary frequency response as it pertains to market clearing, but I will say the opportunity cost following system frequency for devices that are very capable of doing so is near zero. So where there's like a competing use case, perhaps it's serving resiliency or some other function that competes with participation for SCED following or more long duration reserve responses. There's a whole set of resources there that would be more inclined to participate because the use case is so gentle. That's a lot of words to say, frequency perturbations are slight and transitory, and interrupting charging or discharging to accommodate that is much less intrusive than planning on a 10 or 30-minute dispatch. Thanks.
All right. I'm not seeing any hands. Were there any other hands up? Oh, one, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would say that I think the policy question that we can answer is how much optionality to participate can we provide in this phase of the governing document? To kind of Greg's point, the benefit of getting RRS in there now is that we create optionality so that if you're trying to figure out the best use case and the most gentle use case for how you're going to utilize the resources that are in your ADER, you should have the optionality to do so. If we don't get it in there now, then it's kind of like you start to assess the quantitative or the commercial value of one service participation option without really having the benefit of working with ERCOT to figure out the optimized approach to basically making the most money and creating the most value around resiliency and the primary use case of the assets that are going to be in these ADERs. So it seems like the right approach for us to think about from a policy perspective, make the berth wide so that people can make strong decisions around their dispatch strategy. And we don't do that if we don't get RRS in there now.
Okay, well, certainly, as Dave mentioned, I don't think this necessarily closes the door on RRS. That's still part of this, but I think it might be something that requires some additional discussion and refinement
Sure.
to make sure that is enabled.
Yeah, and I think it's a market certainty thing too, right? So when we talk about it, let's say I'm doing a, which I have with utility data, we're talking about opportunity in ADER. The folks that are upstream investor and the companies that are on this call and not are looking at this document truly as an investment signal. So even if there aren't 15 companies ready today to provide that service, if we create a written pathway that's very concrete in here, then you create the basis for people to spend the time and the money on creating the value proposition. It won't work in reverse. No one's going to invest in this if we don't give them a path to do it. So yeah, I'm not saying that we need to have it all figured out immediately, but I think in the phase 3 final language, there needs to be something that an investor will read and say, yes, this is real. Does that make sense, Ryan?
Yes, thank you.
You.
All right. Well, maybe I will keep going, and please, if I miss any hands up, please don't hesitate to interrupt. So the purpose, essentially, there's very little. I guess sort of the general purposes remain the same. I think where we've added additional language here is just incorporating this new participation model or existing participation model that will be ported over to allow non-controllable load participation. Thank you to the author here. I appreciate folks looking at this, giving it a second set of eyes. So I think that ANCLR was something that had been discussed, but may have just been missed in the formatting. So appreciate those second set of eyes. So again, this is more of just a recap of what we had talked about in the summary. As it pertains to phase 3, again, I think these are mostly just nominal edits to bring this up to speed with phase 3. The board approval date, of course, is dependent on when it goes to the board and when we have approval at the task force level. In terms of the policy questions, I don't think there's anything fundamentally different here that we have been proposing to add, but I think there will be some discussion around the pilot project, the program parameters to incorporate what we have been discussing in the summary here. So I did want to highlight in particular a bullet that I know that we have discussed at the task force, but I think it's something that we would really be looking for some additional feedback and ideally consensus on what the view is at the task force level when it comes to the requirements for the NCLR participation model. So if we were to just port the existing NCLR model into this governing document, this second bullet here that my mouse cursor is on is an important requirement. So there is still the requirement that the resource be modeled as a load resource, an aggregation of premises, all the sites located within a single load zone and with the same DSP. However, again, just porting the language over, ADRs participating as an NCLR, the sites are not required to have the same LSE. So that, I think, is one policy question that is outstanding. I know that we had some discussion and a number of members of the task force have made representations on that. But this is one area if stakeholders wanted to focus on, this is one that ideally we'd like to have the view represented at the task force level to the extent that there is one. I think ERCOT could probably live with this existing language, or maybe there is some rationale that the sites should have the same LSE. So I may just pause there. I see Ned had his hand up, and I think, Ned, you had a comment here, so maybe I'll hand that over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. You can hear me?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, and that's right. I apologize. When I tried to put the comments in, I couldn't find a way to store it other than just as author, so it all showed up like that. But yeah, this is one that I know I've raised before. We've talked about multiple times, and frankly, it's just a bigger can of worms than I think what we can, or it opens up a bigger can of worms than what we as a task force uh, can resolve. And it gets back to a lot of the same issues that were taken up and discussed and wrestled over about a decade ago in the Loads and Sched V2 discussions that took place back then, and there's a big issue that you open up when when you have these third party aggregations where it directly impacts the costs that a rep incurs to, or a load serving entity more broadly incurs to hedge their load position. When you have very sensitive loads, um, the financial there is a financial knife's edge that you effectively sit on. And so if you are anticipating load at a certain level and it overshoots, then you're buying high. If the load undershoots, you tend to be selling low. And from that hedge position. And I think it doesn't take a whole lot of doesn't take a whole lot of brain power to realize that buying high and selling low is not a viable business proposition. So that is, I think that's really at the core of the issue, and that's why a decade ago when the ERCOT stakeholders looked at it, TAC endorsed a method to address that cross settlement between the LSE and the third party aggregator, which was the LMP minus proxy dollar G treatment. But that is not something that I think we've really teed up in this phase of the pilot. So unless and until we can get across that, there is a pretty hard opposition that you'll hear, at least from me, on this. And frankly, there's other considerations that also need to be taken up, like how do you manage customer protections and for entities that aren't regulated by the Public Utility Commission, whereas the load serving entities clearly are. So that's my soliloquy. That kind of overviews the comment, and I saw that there's some support from Octopus on that. So I don't know if Rajiv has anything to add on, but I also see others are in the queue, so I'll put my hand down.
Thank you, Ned. The next I have in the queue that I can see is Greg Thurner. So please go ahead, Greg.
Thanks, Ryan. This is a departure from the current NCLR process for those aggregated or single site resources, I should say, that are providing RRS and ECRS today. Is that right?
No, and Mark can probably jump in if I'm incorrect. This is actually, so this language, well, not this language, this concept is already part of the NCLR.
Got it. Okay, so this is parallel to that. That's what I was looking for. Thank you.
Yes.
No, that's exactly right. Yes. There's no prohibition, or there's no requirement that the QSC representing the current NCLRs today have to be the same QSC or the QSC representing the LSCs. So this is consistent.
So another way, or maybe putting it in the same way, is that this exists today. Joel, you had your hand up next. Oh, maybe you didn't. Run away. Youssef.
Oh,
sorry. Or did you? Go ahead, Joel. Go ahead, Joel.
Oh,
sorry,
yes.
Your hand disappeared there.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I try to unmute myself and load my hand instead. And sorry for jumping on a little late, but appreciate the work ERCOT's done on this issue. For Enchanted Rock as a operator of distributed resources, that is not a rep. This particular feature is really gating feature for us to be able to get into the ADER program. We'd like to see the language stay intact if possible, but I know there was a discussion we had on the last call about if there's a natural cutoff between residential and small commercial and larger facilities that would address some of the concerns raised by Ned. I'm curious to hear from the rep community whether there is appetite in, carving out some difference there, or and also curious from ERCOT's perspective if that's even feasible, or you think that's feasible in how you're administering the program to draw a distinction and have different rules for different size facilities.
I guess, Joel, and I'm in the queue for something
go
else,
ahead.
but just from a feasibility point of view, I think we've heard some of that feedback. And I guess I have some questions for Ned a little bit about the comment he shared. But from an administrative point of view, as long as we have some sort of clear delineation in terms of when it's allowed for the QSC to be other than the LSE QSC versus when it is allowed, and that's clear in the rules. I don't see that being a major burden in terms of administration. I think that would be pretty clear, just whether it's size based or something along those lines. That would be data that would already be inherent in what we get as part of the DOTA. So I mean, I think there's other reasons people are perhaps concerned about it, but I don't think that's the hurdle.
Got it. Thanks.
Dave, you said did you want to talk about this comment, the settlement comment, or was that just a future thing?
No, I'm sorry. I think Joel also wanted some feedback from the reps as well. So I'd rather sort of finish that train of thought. I do have a question, so I'll leave my hand up to be in the queue.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to go in order. I don't see. I'm not sure who's with whom, but I think Christina Rollins is up next. Go ahead, Christina.
Hi, this is Christina Rollins with NRG. I had a question first and then a follow-up comment to what Ned and Joel had said. So my first question is, if we had sort of this ANCLR participation, would any of the performance requirements or telemetry requirements be relaxed for the participation of that ANCLR as compared to what the NCLR requires today? I know things might have to be a little bit different, but would you consider any of the requirements as being relaxed?
We do get into the telemetry requirements. I might just hold on that. I'm going to pass the baton to Mark, who's going to talk about some of the changes related to that. So maybe we can cover that in the next section, and then if your question isn't answered there, please we can revisit it.
Okay, and so that might be relevant to the comment. So we share some of the same concerns that Ned has. At the same time, I think what Enchanted Rock, what Joel had mentioned, is something that, could potentially make logical sense, because as you aggregate these resources, that's where we get concerned that you would see attempts to try to do aggregations of those customer protected rule classes, right? Because it really doesn't make sense to put individual premises in to any of these products. So that's when you have a really uneven playing field insofar as reps have to comply with all of the customer protection rules of the PUC and third parties don't. And so there might be something workable that, with the larger folks like an Enchanted Rock, I would assume that typically a rep would have visibility into what is going on, because there might be a contractual relationship there. And so that might also help mitigate some of the concerns we have about swinging the load around at times that are would not be visible to us. So in terms of breakpoints, I don't know how you can see this over at ERCOT, and the customer classes don't fall along the same lines as TDU rate classes, but there might be some rate classes that you can look at as being solidly outside of what's covered under the PUC's rules. So that's all I had.
Okay, thank you. Ned, you're up next.
Thank you. So I did want to try to give some clarification, because I heard some of that discussion last time about the distinction between residential and large commercial, and I do think there is a difference between the state of the world today versus what we're talking about in this context. So in the state of the world today, where it's a single site, it's usually a very large and sophisticated customer, and there is, an active negotiation that can go on between the load serving entity and that third party that's taking place, including some of those cross settlement provisions that I mentioned. When we start talking about doing aggregations, then we're getting into a scenario where, I should say, first off, large customers are not monolithic, right? There is a spectrum of, engagement and sophistication even in the large customer classes. So, to the extent that there are aggregations that are then more blind to the load serving entity, that is, it creates a risk for that load serving entity. It is effectively creating a negative externality for that entity that's taken on the responsibility to serve the load. So while I agree with Christina's point that maybe the customer protection provisions aren't applicable, may not be applicable in those scenarios because they're large enough to waive them, the the contractual and the financial interest in protecting downside risk is still very much there. So, and it's not like something where there is a clean line where you can say, across this point, it's it's all fine. It really is, a difference between right now where there is a one-to-one interaction and that can be specifically addressed versus and frankly coordination between the the aggregator and the load serving entity is is forced to happen directly versus an aggregation where it's all happening kind of in the in the background. So I think the framework that we have now certainly encourages and enables load serving entities and the third party aggregators to work together to get to that same solution. So Joel, I'm sensitive to certainly sensitive to your what you're saying. I do think there is probably a path for folks like Enchanted Rock to work with the load serving entities to get to that same point, but I think that has to happen on a one-to-one contractual level.
Thank you, Ned. Youssef, you're up.
Yep. I mean, Ned, in the spirit of not opening up cans of worms that have already been opened, I think sticking to the if framework as it currently exists, allowing, NCLRs to participate in ancillary services without being the LSE would be sufficient, right? Like we're currently third-party aggregators are currently allowed to participate with NCLRs in ancillary service programs. And that's already been decided. So I think going back on that is actually opening the can of worms that's already been discussed. And I think given that in this venue, we're trying to kind of figure out how to get ADRs to participate, it doesn't make sense to rehash kind of this conversation. But additionally, I think as this task force, I think the main goal is to try to expand participation as much as possible. And I think this kind of really limits the possibilities. I think third-party aggregators have been quite, influential and impactful in getting as much load as possible online. So I think in the spirit of doing that, we should continue to apply the same rules and allow, third-party aggregators to participate. We at Voltus already submitted comments yesterday to that effect. And I think our arguments there are more fleshed out compared to what I can discuss here. But I think I'd really urge the task force to kind of keep things as they are, as they are in the NOLO protocols, allowing third-party aggregators to participate on behalf of NCLRs. And then the last thing I wanted to say is that even in a case where you're using an aggregation, I don't see how, as a third-party aggregator, we'd be able to participate without having some kind of contractual agreement with the customer, no matter how small or big, to be able to participate in our aggregation. So I think there will I don't see how we'd curtail a customer's load, with them not knowing or them not knowing that it'd be enrolled. So I think they would always have visibility into that, and we'd always have a contractual relationship with a customer, no matter how big or small. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf. Amy Hart.
Excuse me. Hey, folks. Thanks for the conversation here. I tend to agree with Yusuf, and apologize for the background noise. I'll do the best I can here at the airport. I tend to agree, like taking a step back. One, these are existing rules. And if I even take my Sunrun hat off, like our role in the ADR task force is to build pathways and make sure we're trying to bring all of these resources to the grid in a pilot format. And so thinking about how we do that with the checks and with the protection. So making sure that we have like that same reporting and verification, and you're encouraging, basically we're sending signals to the marketplace to come forward with solutions, right? That can help ERCOT within the rules to be able to have the reporting and verification. So we're not preemptively limiting our pilot. So if we're moving forward with this, which I encourage that we do, I think there's two things. I don't think we preemptively limit based on size. Residential folks need pathways, right? There's huge resources going in because the grid has been going down because of weather-related outages, and so let's put that to work. We may, though, agreeing with NRG and others that there are unique consumer protections that need to be included here for aggregators that LSEs need to provide. And so we may want to make a notation about one of our governing documents or one of our tasks for this year would be to come up with those recommendations for consumer protections or what would be needed for base level inclusion in those contracts. Again, apologies for the background, so I'm trying to keep it short, but I think we just need to encourage as many solutions with the opportunity to come back if we identify issues or challenges.
Thank you, Amy. Mark.
I don't have anything more after all of those the comments made.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Rajiv.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to piggyback on what Ned and Christina have shared here. I think we, as a business, just being more focused on the resi and small commercial and seeing more opportunities for sort of that misalignment and customer confusion there. Certainly, I think we fall more into sort of the Christina camp. Perhaps there is a way we can kind of define sort of a threshold between sort of the smaller commercial and residential customers and larger classes that would be workable here. But we're strongly in favor of maintaining the LSE QSE link for the residential and smaller commercial classes. I would note that like for the concern that Ned is, I think, rightly raising here, not all larger customers are the same, and we're talking about aggregations, not sort of single site NCLR model that has existed in the market for some time. For those larger customers, one of the things I suggested in the comment following up to Ned's is sort of a notice provision and where if an aggregator is going to be kind of bringing a resource to the market, that the rep or the LSE is notified and given the ability to sort of object there. I don't know if that could maybe make things more workable from Ned's perspective, but just something I thought I'd throw out there.
Thanks, Rajiv. Dave.
I'm so sorry. It took me took me a second to find the unmute. I guess just to go back to, I mentioned I had a question earlier. I guess we had talked about some of the sophistication points, some of the impacts to reps for hedging, consumer protection, stuff like that. So a lot of those I think were items that were shared. The one thing that was new was the this, and I remember it, but I'm not sure I understand the relevance with the LMP minus proxy G debate that happened several years ago. Then can you just maybe talk a little bit more about how that factors into this above and beyond just kind of the other concerns that we've talked about already?
I can, but I can also wait. I can put my hand up and wait.
Maybe Ned, I'll jump to you just to make sure that we don't lose the too many trains of thoughts here. So why don't you, if you're okay to respond to that question, then we'll get back in the queue.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So Dave, the thought there is that, the load serving entity has taken a financial position to hedge the load that is then being curtailed by another entity that is not acting in a coordinated fashion with the load serving entity's position. And so essentially they are selling a hedge that they don't own. And so the principle behind LMP minus dollar proxy G was, how can we address that in a way that is objective? And so I think the working group or the task force, I forget what it was called, but they spent a lot of time trying to think through what different indexes for that could be a reasonable stand-in for the value of that hedge would be. And so with the LMP minus dollar proxy G framework, I think they came up with use the customer class's polar rate as a something that is public, available, and in most instances is probably likely to cover the impact. Not necessarily always true, but that was the thought at the time. It was the best that the working group could get to.
Yeah.
So that's the principle that it's trying to cover.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I'll think more about it too. But it sounds like at the highest level, it's a component or subset of the topic of reps trying to hedge this load when someone else potentially has control over it. So that's very helpful context. Thank you, Ned.
Thanks very much, Ned. Rushi.
Okay, so back in the early days before there was a docket or a project number for this proceeding, the memo in which the guidance was provided from the commission, which I now have linked into our chat for those of us who have come to this project at later times. There was a bit of a balancing act in drafting out the principles for the pilot. So I'm just putting this in here as a resource because this is starting to feel like something where we exercise our option under the charter to seek commission guidance on a specific issue where we might not be able to get group agreement. While I personally, as in the subject matter expertise world, really like the potential to scalpel along the lines that Joel and Christina have suggested, one of the reasons behind the way that this language was drafted, I will be very objective in how I just described this, was that we wanted to try at the outset, we as in the body largely, to create a structure that attracts broad participation through LSEs. The initial constraints, therefore, in this language were drafted around the idea that if we can get to big sizes, then we could get to more complexity. So it was never not envisioned that the task force would not address the very question we're addressing here right now about the opportunity or the possibilities of splitting how capacity appears to the market from diverse LSE structures. But there was something to the way we went about it with this writing that focused on creating depth and in the market participation before we got really creative. What I'm hearing from how the NCLR framework is administered today is that it feels like a very narrow way to create a creative approach to being in the market. And it doesn't break anything today, especially if we create strong parameters around distinguishing larger customer types that can avail of this from the Resi TDU classes. I completely agree, by the way, with everyone who has said everything that if we were to break open the residential market today, aggregations will never scale. Aggregations have to be, what, 10, 15 megawatts for them to be economic. We're trying to create an economic business model. So I'm throwing this out there to give people more foundation on which to ultimately make decisions that will be a strong policy cut. And it's my invitation for folks to debate this with a little more insight from, some of the early work of the task force days. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that, Arushi. I appreciate that stepping back to the founding and potentially a governance option here that we could utilize to help resolve this question. Colin, your hand up.
Hi, my name's Colin Smith with LEAP, a demand response aggregator. We have not been involved in this task force for as long as Arushi has, or this particular program. So I appreciate that context. We have been active participants in the task force meetings this year. I appreciate Arushi's thinking around kind of using some existing opportunities to seek commission guidance to break this deadlock. It doesn't seem like we're, through this conversation, have reached a solution to this non-rep divide that seems to have been created in the conversation. I will note that as a non-rep, LEAP does not currently participate in ADER and sees, similar to Voltus, this as being a major barrier to our participation. We agree largely with the comments that Voltus filed today. Encourage everyone to read it. I'll note also one thing that Voltus said in those comments, which is that keeping this or removing this QSE matching requirement would not prevent customers from participating in ADER through their rep. And in many ways, it seems like it might be beneficial for them to participate through their rep. However, in the interest of opening up this program to the largest number of megawatts possible, it is beneficial from both a free market perspective and a program expansion perspective to find solutions to the challenges that the reps have raised, but not see them as insurmountable barriers, which we at LEAP don't believe they necessarily are. Overall, keeping in focus what Yusuf said, which is that really, if customers in Texas are only able to participate in ADER through their rep, that precludes a lot of participation, including, customers whose reps don't participate in ADER at the moment. And so if we want to stay focused on the goal of scaling this program, it's really important that we find some solution to allow for this QSE matching requirement to be removed.
Thank you, Colin. Resmi.
Hi, Rashmi Surendran with Shell. I don't want to reiterate all the comments that the rep coalition or the rep groups have said earlier, but we have similar concerns, and our position is we are similar to what Ned has expressed. We have all the same concerns with reps not knowing what the aggregators doing, which is applicable not just for RESI, but all for larger loads as well. So.
Okay. Thank you, Rashmi. Yusuf, you had your hand up again. Go ahead. Oh, it's down. What was up? Okay.
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. Sorry. One question I have for the reps that I think maybe might elucidate certain points is when you're signing up a customer to a contract, you don't always have visibility in how they'll be using electricity, right? Or when they'll be using electricity, when they'll be curtailing. Like you might have some guesses based on, historical load or so on, or their customer type, but isn't part of your role as a retailer to also kind of understand what the bounds of what is possible is? I don't see, like, for instance, if you're in an ancillary service program and you curtail like a few times a year when you get a dispatch call. I don't see how that's like disproportionately different to like maybe variations in how a consumer would consume electricity on a random Monday. Right? Maybe their foreman gets sick or something and they have to shut off. Right. So I don't think it's like that different, but maybe a clarification would help. I see that you raised your hand.
Yeah, so I'll say, Yusuf, again, it's not like customers are monolithic and there's the same treatment for all of them. Some will have more interaction and communication, others will move a little bit more randomly, but typically you'll probably see some of that in the historical load data, and that allows you to take it into account. As you try to put together a hedge profile for them. But it's really going to be with those larger, more sophisticated customers where you're doing more one-on-one engagement, that you'll get more of that sense of when they're going to change. And as you get to the smaller customers, they tend, especially with residential and small commercial, they tend to have more of a weather profile, and so that tends to follow, of course, the weather patterns. And then, so I don't know if that helps answer your question, but it's not a singular approach. But certainly, if there is a material change in how and how the customer is consuming electricity, that can have an impact. It can actually have an impact for the customer depending on the terms of their contract and whether there are certain swing provisions that apply to them. And so that can also be something to manage, which does kind of bring me back to a point that I had forgotten to mention as part of one of the other costs that load serving entities also accrue from an uncoordinated third-party aggregation, is brand risk. And this is not necessarily an abstract concept. A couple of years ago, there was a lot of news stories, and I think quite a few even PUC complaints that came against reps, asserting that the rep is throttling my thermostat during a heat wave. And the backstory to that ended up being that it was actually a third party demand response aggregator that had basically an evergreen contract with the customer, again not covered by the customer protection rules, and they were the ones that were throttling the customer's thermostat up to it was, I think in the story it was somewhere in the mid to low 80s, but in a heat wave that was very uncomfortable. But all of that brand damage accrues to the rep and not to that third party aggregator. So I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight that as well, because the value of your brand is very important.
Thank you, Ned. I see Christina has her hand up. Maybe we'll take Christina's comment, and then I would like to make sure that we do have opportunity to get through the rest of the document. So go ahead, Christina.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring up the example that Ned mentioned, and that gets to, the customer protection concern is that was an issue that did occur where a third-party demand response provider had a contractual relationship with customers. Unbeknownst to some of the customers, customers may not have remembered who they were or how they could contact them because, for example, they can't go on the PUC's website and look up their registration or their actual contact people. So that was an issue we did have to work through with the PUC. And as far as like the residential customer group, their demand is relatively inelastic, right? And we had measures such as House Bill 16 a couple sessions ago where it reduced and eliminated their exposure to wholesale energy prices. And they also don't necessarily chase for CP, right, to minimize their transmission costs. So they don't behave in the same way a larger customer necessarily would. So to that, if you add in what Ned was saying is something is materially different, right, and there's a third party that might be impacting what you anticipate their consumption pattern may be based upon the product that you have them on, it really can swing what your anticipated load would be. And so couple that with the customer protection concerns that we just talked about. That's not something that you should try to solve here without resolving, one, should we create another party that will interact with the customer in the space. And then the second one would be if you get to yes on that, then you have to ensure that they're registered and regulated by the PUC. And that's nothing that those steps haven't happened yet. So if you're trying to move on this other piece about the ANCLR, it makes sense to focus that on customers that are already outside the rules.
Thank you, Christina. So I don't want to put Jason and Joel, you all on the spot here, but at least from where I'm sitting, it sounds like we have probably two high-level positions for and against on this concept, and then within that, there may be some refinements or subtleties within each of these positions. Do you have any thoughts on how we want to manage this in terms of next steps? Is this something that we want to discuss internally, or is this something we want to bring to the commission? If it's something we want to cover after, that's fine, but I just thought I'd raise it as we're on here right now.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm sorry, Jason, why don't you go first and I'll go after you.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that I think the conversation has been good. I think in the interest of time, maybe let's table it and come back to it. I guess the question I was going to raise my hand and ask, and then decided not to, but maybe now I'll ask the question. It seems I don't want to speak and put words in people's mouth, but it seems like a lot of the struggle is around residential and smaller commercial customers. And it sounds like there's maybe a consensus that we would carve those folks out. But is there anybody that feels passionate that those folks should be included here and not carved out? I'm just trying to understand where we might have consensus and where we may not.
Just to confirm, when you say carved out, we're talking about this specific provision, right? You're meaning this?
That's right.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. Okay. The hand shot up. So we'll just go through Colin.
Oh, I was raising my hand in response to Jason's question about whether we felt that residential customers should also be included under this QSC matching requirement exemption. We do think that this should be applicable to all customer classes and not split up between commercial and residential customers.
Okay, gotcha. And Amy, do you think the same?
Yeah, I actually think, Jason, I think it's worth tabling and thinking about, is there a sort of a two-step path forward where we don't hesitate, like we don't hold back commercial if you can do one-on-one contracts with larger commercial projects, but we just can't overlook the opportunity, right? If you look at DSGS in California, there's tens and tens of megawatts, right? We alone have 60 megawatts just from residential. So I think if there's concern, which I think we all share about, like, what is that, the consumer protection provisions, maybe it is allowing this to move forward, but also having in this phase, look at what would the consumer protection rules and those contracts need to be to make sure there is visibility and awareness, or at least consider that. So I think unless we have that path forward, I would, it's like, just table it, but I do understand you don't want to hold everybody back until we figure the solution out for Resi. So but I want to make sure, like, we could have a two-step solution moving forward. That would be my suggestion here to get consensus.
Got it. And real quick,
yeah.
Ned, I think you're up next. Sorry, Jason, did you have something you wanted to raise?
No, let's just go ahead and finish these two out, and because I do want to move on, but go ahead, Ned. Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, Jason, to your question, I hope I haven't been unclear in that, the customer protection issue is one of several concerns that we have, but there are frankly the more directly impactful to us as the load serving entity is it does not depend on whether or not there are customer protections. That's a concern for the customer. We're concerned about, the financial investment that we make in serving that customer load, and how that how that is either under how that is utilized by a third party. So I don't see a clean line between larger and smaller customers, but so I don't think we have full consensus there.
Yep, understood. Just trying to pick apart a couple of different places to see where we might have some consensus. I've confirmed that we don't have consensus on any of that. So why don't we just mark that down as something that we'll have to work through the governance of, and we can keep rolling through the document.
Yeah, Jason, if it makes sense, maybe we get a small group call together separately. I guess recognizing the holidays are upon us, maybe we just have to trade some email, but I can try to kick off like a smaller group chain for the reps and the DER providers to maybe continue the discussion offline.
I think that would be good. We do have the holidays, and I don't want to be the Grinch, but we also have ERCOT's board meeting coming up, and I don't think we want to severely delay some of the other good things in this document. So I think, Joel, if you'll take the lead on seeing what we can get to consensus on, and where we can't, I think that'd be great. Arushi, real quick.
Just look at the chat for my comment. Doing comparables is a good idea. That's all.
Got it. Thank you. All right, Ryan, back to you.
Okay. So I'm going to turn things over to Mark shortly when we get to the exceptions to the ERCOT rules section, but there are two other things that I wanted to point out. Again, a lot of this is driven by the feedback that we have heard about trying to expand the pilot and looking at the caps to participation. So what we have proposed here is two things. One, we have essentially proposed to double the system-wide cap and the respective caps of capacity that would be eligible. So increasing the system-wide cap from 80 to 160 and the respective ancillary service caps from 40 to 80. And there was one other thing it's missing, so it's notable by its absence. Is we had proposed additionally there was a system-wide limit that no QSE would be allowed to register more than 20% of these system-wide limits. Again, this is based on feedback. I don't want to necessarily put words that this is a uniform position, but some QSEs have said that this also makes it challenging to grow the product. So again, I do want to make sure that we have time to go through the next section, but maybe I'll just pause to see if there are any questions about that section. Ed, go ahead.
Thanks, Ryan. And I was the one that dropped the question in about the, actually, I don't know if I see it anymore. I'd had a.
This might not be the most current version. I think that there's probably one that's been edited in real time, so I might have the best one. So apologies for that, Ned.
Okay. So on the 20% per queasy limit, I know that we've heard from folks that have had concerns that that can be a I think a limit on interest in investing in it, in the capabilities, but with the increase in the size, the total limit from 80 megawatts to 160, as well as the proposed elimination of zonal limits that I think are further down. I'm wondering why we would need to get rid of the queasy limits, since, and I think this was a point Arushi was reminding us of just a little bit ago, is part of the intent of the pilot is to develop, broader LSE experience with the ADER program or pilot. So in other words, is the concern already addressed through those other two changes from a practical standpoint that doesn't force us to undermine the principle of encouraging broad participation?
Hey, Ryan, may I
Yeah, please
answer?
go,
I guess
go ahead,
I
Dave.
was I actually had read Ned's comment earlier today, so I was in the queue to respond to it anyways. I mean, I guess now I'll say for this one, I don't know that ERCOT has super strong feelings one way or the other. Our thought in eliminating it as a starting point for the conversation here is more driven by the fact that we're now 2 years into the pilot. I think the original thought behind this language is that some entities may be further along than others. So, you know, right off the bat, we may see specific entities sort of subsume the entirety of the pilot. 2 years later, it felt like that was less important. Now, to your point, we're increasing the system-wide limits. We're making some other changes. It may not be necessary, and there may still be value in having it. But that was at least the mindset that we had when we struck the language, if that's helpful. But open to feedback, and you know, if the general consensus, whatever you'd like to call it, is that that language still has value, I don't think we'd be fine adding it back. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Rajiv.
Yeah, I'll just echo Ned here. I feel like this is sort of addressed, given that the cap on the total pilot is doubling. And I think there's another consideration here, which is kind of ensuring sort of broader participation across the market. So from our perspective, the 20% limit should just be retained.
Okay, thank you. Ned, looks like you're up.
And just to respond to Dave, what you were laying out, I think and I've said this before, you know, the pilot has done a good job of galvanizing a lot of development activity with the LSEs. And while you only have seen two get all the way across the finish line, I think there is a lot more activity that is just not quite visible in the formal sense yet. So, you know, I think it's a little premature to say, well, it's been 2 years and you know, it's not as much of a concern. It's I think it's just taken a little bit longer. Frankly, the customer call it density of with you know the devices that can be aggregated is taken a little bit longer to get to a critical mass. So, but I think we'll get there, and I think it's beneficial for us to still hold that space for as many LCs as possible to get that experience.
Okay, well, and certainly we're also opening up the participation models as part of the other design. So perhaps we'll see some new players and there's still value. So I guess just Ryan and others with ERCOT, it sounds like the feedback sounds like that's still is something we want to be retained. But I'm sorry, I guess I also see Joel in the queue. He may have a different view.
You predicted it, Dave. You know, definitely have a different view on this. You know, we didn't necessarily advocate for the removal of the 20% queasy limit, but I think the direction that the pilot's headed in terms of, you know, trying to attract broader megawatt participation, the challenge from Commissioner Glotfelty, and, you know, the hope that this becomes a sustainable permanent program with ERCOT, the 20% cap really feels like artificial and unnecessary piece right now with multiple entities looking to enter, you know, at least for the larger end of the spectrum of the 1 megawatt DERs that could aggregate. The cap was like definitely challenging. With the cap going to 160, it's helpful, but I think you could easily get beyond the 20% cap with like medium C&I type customers. And this is not just Enchanted Rock. There are other folks in our grid coalition who could bring significant megawatts to the table. We could come back and try to change that again, but I don't know that there's all that much value to keeping it at this point, given the amount of capacity that's available in the program under 160 megawatts, the 160 megawatt cap.
Thanks, Joel. So maybe this is another one that we'll consider tabled for the time being, pending some further discussion. But I think those are the scope of changes. So seeing no other questions, Mark, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I'm okay to drive if you just kind of want to let me know where to go to.
I'll try to give you guide you through this though, so
Sure.
you can handle the presentation. Let's go on down to the bottom of page 7. So again, most of this has been communicated in previous discussions with the task force. This is introducing the new model, the NCLR model. The key points here are that we're going to be using the normal non-controllable load resource model as much as reasonable, as much as makes sense. There's very few exceptions to that. One of the things I would bring to everyone's attention is for phase 1 and phase 2 of the pilot project, there needed to be a combination of what we were piloting was devices that were part of an aggregation that could also inject energy onto the grid. And when we were doing that, because of the ALR concept, needed to be a net load consumption value, we were using offsets. For the non-controllable load, the NCLR model, we're not going to have a requirement that you have to have devices that can inject energy. So what I'm saying is the aggregation can consist solely of premises that consume energy. They're not required to include those that can inject. It doesn't mean that they can't include those. I'm just saying that there's not a requirement there. But going along with that, we've had, at least recently, we've had some internal discussions that, well, maybe the offset then isn't required then if you're going to be an NCLR with only devices that consume. But I think for consistency and also just in case maybe the initial ADER didn't include any devices that could inject energy, it doesn't mean that down the road they may add devices or premises that could do that. So it's my feeling right now that we're even if it looks like it's going to be totally premises or devices that consume, that we'll still apply an offset. I think it'll make it easier and less confusing. Let's go ahead and scroll. I don't think there's really anything else here that we haven't communicated and numerous other things. Let's move on down to page, let me see, I think it's page 10. One of the things, I'm trying to get the right section of page 10. There it is. It's right in the middle of page 10. Something that I think has been a difficult to administer from the very beginning is when we have when we have conflicts within the DOTAs and our ERS program, because there's always this timing issue of, well, when the DOTA is ultimately submitted to ERCOT because it's already gone through the TDSP, and then it comes to ERCOT, and what we do is we do a check against sites, premises that are participating in ERS. And if there's a conflict, we go back to the entity that submitted the DOTA and tell them they need to remove those, they need to resolve those conflicts. And even upon subsequent updates to the DOTAs, then we will do a check against, well, whatever. We could even be in a different standard ERS standard contract term, and then all of a sudden new conflicts could arise. And anyway, the point was, this has been a difficult thing to administer between the DOTA and the ERS. So we're going to make a change moving forward to where the initial DOTA that's submitted to ERCOT, we will just be doing a check against the most current ERS standard contract term at that time. If there is a conflict, that conflict at that point in time will need to be resolved with the entity that submitted the DOTA. But in subsequent updates to the DOTA, if there are conflicts with ERS, we are going to then resolve those within the ERS procurement, not go back to the DOTA itself. So hopefully this will make that process a little smoother. Let's see here. Let's now move down. Actually, I don't think there was a whole lot until we move all the way down to page 16.
Hey, Mark, before you
Okay,
go
I
on,
see.
this is
Yeah.
Suzanne.
Yeah, Suzanne.
I have a question I have a question on that section you were just on. So the question is, you know, I guess the way you've got this set up is that you'd have a blanket prohibition against someone being in both ERS and in ADER. And so the question is there some other solution that could allow you know, somebody to be able to participate in both programs, but just not at the same time? So I guess what I'm thinking about is, like, what if somebody gets selected for just one particular contract period, you know, during the ERS, or, you know, one particular time of day, I guess, for the ERS contract period, but then they'd be prohibited from being able to participate in an ADER activity at all other times when they'd otherwise be available. And so I guess that's just the question: is there any other way around that that would provide more optionality? Sticking with the theme of optionality today.
Yeah, and so let me. I have actually two responses to that. The first one goes back to the ERS rule but it just says that you can't participate in both at the same time. But here's so it almost, I mean, by reading that, just the way it's written, it almost sounds like what you said is, well, as long as you can participate in ERS during certain ERS time periods, but then offer into the ancillary service market the other times. But that's administering that becomes a problem, because if you actually have a deployment of ERS, that deployment could last anywhere from 12 up to 12 hours during the 3 of the standard contract terms, and up to 24 hours in a winter standard contract term for ERS. So you don't ever know when you may be deploying it. So that still would be the problem with trying to allow them to participate in both at the same. I mean, participate in any time period for ERS and still be available in the as an active DOTA. If somebody has a suggestion that we would want us to consider, we'll take a look at it. But that's the problem as we see it.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I was just thinking that whoever's got the resources is obligated to provide ERS has to make sure that they're managing their portfolio to meet their obligation that they've contracted for. And so, they're obviously subject to enforcement action and penalties in the ERS program itself if they fail to perform.
Well, it's still, since it's in the rule, I would think it's still within ERCOT then to put checks in place to make sure we know if that's violation is occurring or not, just not relying on QSCs to self-patrol. I think that could be a problem.
Okay. Be interested to hear if anybody else has any thoughts on it.
Yeah.
Manny, you've got your hand up. Over
Yeah.
you.
Thanks, Ryan. Hey, Mark, it's Manny over at Hunt.
Yeah.
Kind of to follow up on what Suzanne was asking, how are you all looking at it so ERCOT had put out a few RFPs last year. I think it was a couple RFPs last year. And there were some stipulations in which if you participated in a price responsive program before, you could not participate in this RFP. How are you all viewing that in the context of a resource participating in the DOTA or within the DOTA and then rolling off of it? How are you all looking at that?
Maybe, Manny, I'm sorry, I'm not quite following your question.
So let's say there's a resource that's participating in the commercial sense, there's a larger commercial resource participating within the ADER. It rolls off of the ADR, is no longer participating, and ERCOT subsequently puts out an RFP that says it's asking for, let's say it's asking for participation kind of in the South Zone, given the GTC. Would that resource be precluded from participating in that RFP? Because there were some stipulations within the RFP last year that would not allow a resource to participate in a price responsive if they had been price responsive previously.
So you're not talking about ERS, you're talking about a reliability must run alternative, MRA,
Right. Well,
RMP?
yeah, kind of in that context.
Well, I believe there. Well, I would hear. That's a good question. I'm not that close to the RFP process for the MRAs, but I would suspect with the DOTA, I mean, with the pilot project, before we I guess procure a response to the RFP, that we would need to be doing a check against the DOTAs as well, because we do that for the services that we administer in-house. So okay. I would think that same check would have to be done before we sign the contracts for the MRA.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't know if there's another ERCOT person that's closer to the MRA process on the call. I'd welcome your input.
I mean, I guess, Mark, the only thing I'd add, I mean, Manny, I take your question to be, if ERCOT were to issue the same RFP today, would participation in the pilot be considered something that would prohibit you from participating? Is that the real question?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean,
yeah.
Last year when there was a prohibition of resources that were price responsive from participating in that RFP. So would participation in the ADER preclude anybody from submitting for that for kind of future RFPs in which you all are looking for demand response type activities?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll share my opinion, although I want to go back and look at any sort of specific language, but the answer would be yes. Really, the intent of those other contracts are to get something that's really is net new, and to the degree someone's already participating in this pilot, that wouldn't be net new. That was at a highest level, that was the concept between some of that language in the RFP. So, that would have to be looked at more explicitly if we were to issue another RFP like that, but that would be what I had shared today, at least.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions before we move on? All right, so again, let's move on down to page 16. So now getting into, yeah, let you get down there. The we can so this gets back to telemetry validation. And again, you've heard me say this almost every time I talk, that to me one of the most important pieces within this whole pilot, the aggregated resource, is doing telemetry validation. And we continue to, it seems like, have lessons learned with each passing phase. Historically, in phase 1 and phase 2, all of the DOTAs that have been submitted have all requested to use device level telemetry. We started now to have interest in some to use premise level telemetry, and as we started walking through the requirement with some interested market participants, we realized there was still some issues with the language that was in the governing document pertaining to telemetry validation. Specifically, had to do with the condition 1, because if you're using, and let me explain this, if you're using premise level telemetry, that telemetry is going to consist of both. Part of it is going to be load that is dispatchable or deployed, that can be deployed, and then probably even in the case of residential premises, well, there's going to be quite a bit of load that's firm. Basically, for all practical purposes, is not going to be varying that much. Is going to be firm load. So it didn't make sense for the condition 1 to be based off of your DR capability. And we realized that. So we've modified the condition to 1. And actually, I think maybe it was my fault and we've moved to the wrong. Let me see. Let me find the exact. Hang on just 1 second. 16 is maybe the one I have doesn't line up with. Right, I think no. Keep scrolling up now.
Up?
No. I think that was it, right? That's that what you were right
okay.
in the right section.
Okay.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah. So now the condition 1, the whole point of using condition 1 is we only want to evaluate those intervals in which we have a sizable amount of telemetry values to measure. We don't want to. It's difficult. We've found that if we're measuring very small values, the metric can be very, very difficult to meet. And that would be the case, and that's the reason we modify the language now. That since so now just condition 1 is as long as the withdrawal or the injection from the aggregation of the premises at least 0.1 megawatt, then those intervals will be measured to meet the metric. I think that's a lot more logical than the consumption values, or the consumption capability for those sites. So hopefully that clears that up with premise level telemetry, and that'll apply not only to the new NCLR model, but it'll apply as well to the ALR model moving forward as well. So that's one change that we took that we've made to this governing document for telemetry validation. And then the other section was even when we're talking about if they're choosing to use device level telemetry, again, it gets back to trying to set a different metric if it's a really small value. We've now made the change that if the capability is less than or equal to 1 megawatt, then the metric is that the telemetry value just must be within 50% of the of the device of the aggregate of the device level data provided. But if it's greater than 1 megawatt, then we will still require it to be within, it will need to be within 10% of the values. So hopefully these two improvements will make it, I think it's more appropriate measurements for these aggregations, especially taking into consideration if they're small, which historically a majority of them have still been fairly small aggregations in capability. Any questions on the telemetry validation changes? All right. All right. I think the only other thing that I wanted to share that is a change, but it's not a change that you're going to find within the governing document, is and I think this was a question that came up earlier about maybe changing the telemetry validation requirements for ALRs. If y'all remember right, if they chose to use device level telemetry, we required 1 minute device level data to be provided on each device as part of the validation process. For the NCLR model, because these are not having to follow SCED base points, and I've promised I wasn't going to use this term, but because they come off in larger blocks, some people call it blocky, trying to get away from that term. But for the NCLR model, the requirement will be we will require only a 5-minute interval data from each device instead of the 1 minute. Now, none of that the 1 minute or the 5 minute is not found in the governing document. It is found in other qualification documents that's posted to the ADER webpage. There's two documents. There's the ADER telemetry validation SCED qualification and AS qualification document, and the ADER device level telemetry validation instruction document. Both of those documents are going to need to be updated to reflect the updates to the governing document. That those updates have not been made yet. But at this point, I'm kind of committing to try to have those done by the middle of January sometime. But those changes, again, we are going to be allowing up to 5-minute interval data for the NCLR model for telemetry validation. Oh, I'm being asked, none of those need to go to TAC, right? I do not believe so. Those were not, well, I guess we don't even have really an OBD. Maybe I'll need to have an attorney tell me. I don't think those documents were approved by TAC to begin with. I don't remember that happening. So I don't think so. I think we can just make them and get them posted to the webpage. That's all I really had to share with the changes for the governing document pertaining to telemetry validation and or the new NCLR model. Ryan, I assume you're just scrolling in case anybody has any questions with some of these other items.
Yeah, the only thing I was thinking we might want to note, and I guess this is not necessarily new, but it is germane to the NCL, like the performance evaluation.
Yeah, that's not, so the performance evaluation for an NCLR is going to be just like any NCLR today. We will use the meter before, meter after baseline concept. So it's what the telemetry showed revealed during a 5-minute period prior to the instruction to what the resource did, what the telemetry shows the resource did during the sustained response period after the instruction. And then the metric is the same as it is for any NCLR. You must be within 95 to 150% of your obligation to pass the metric.
Thanks, Mark. Looks like we do have a couple of questions. Manny?
Thanks, Ryan. Hey, Mark, how are you all viewing dispatch? Assuming that one of these ALRs or NCLRs are dispatched, are they going to be recalled once there is a recall signal from ERCOT? So theoretically, it could be, if we were in Winter Storm Uri, it could be 100+ hours. Is that accurate?
The deployment remains in effect until recalled. That's what the language is in the protocols, Manny.
Okay.
Yeah. So
I just want to make sure we're absolutely clear about what the expectation is.
There's not a a separate carve out for the length of deployment for an NCLR that's currently proposed in the pilot project.
Okay, so theoretically, if we had a behind the meter thermal that was participating in this, it would have to continue generating into the signal until we receive a
recall instruction.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Yes, sir. Ned?
Thanks, Mark. And this probably dovetails a little bit from on this, but I think it was on page 20. I'm not sure where we are. Yeah, so there was, looks like we have different a different view. It's the last bullet under the device level telemetry referenced a
Sorry, am I in the right neighborhood?
yeah, there. Okay, yeah, I see the comment. It seemed that there was a reference to the SCED base point instruction, and wasn't sure if that was. I thought this was referring to the NCLR.
Ned, I think we just didn't pick up on that. There for the NCLR, there is no SCED base point.
Okay, that's what I thought.
That was an error.
With everything else. Okay. Okay. The other question I had was, I just see the comment about the RTC future proofing, and it sounds like that might be a tangential topic, so we can hold that if there are other questions.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry and I had put that. I think as we take this back and look at some potential edits based on feedback and whether they're cleanups or something a little bit more substantive, I think there's a way to write this to make it future proof that we may be a little bit more than just taking out Dan. So I think it's probably fairly straightforward, but just want to kind of capture that note for us internally.
Dave, is that something that you think we would want to get into this document for phase 3, or are you thinking that needs to come back again?
I think we can just take it. I think we can take it and try to include something in phase 3. At least for this. I don't know that I've looked at the rest of the document from a future proofing point of view, but from that particular sentence, I think there's some ways to talk about it that make it future proof. That we can capture as part of this approval.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
You said
Ryan.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the dispatch duration limits. Is it worth thinking about whether or not we should consider reviewing those? Just if you think about participation of batteries under the NCLR frameworks, if a load has a battery and they're using that to curtail, um, it kind of like prohibits or makes it hard for batteries to participate in this pilot as a result if they're participating under the NCLR framework. Is that something worth considering, or is it outside the scope of this discussion?
Dave, do you have do you have an opinion on that?
Not off the top of my head, Mark. I mean, I think in general for the performance, we've tried to, we're kind of stealing from or borrowing from, maybe it's a better term, from some of our existing participation models. So I know we've tried to use those to a large degree possible. So I think that was really the nature of not having a carve out here. My my thought is to not create additional carves out, but we can think about that more. I guess, Mark, any additional thoughts on your end for today?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that potentially just opens a much bigger can of worms. Could continue using the can of worms concept.
Yeah, thanks, Al.
All right. I think those are the extent of the edits that I think we had for phase 3. So maybe I will turn things over to the chair if we want to just talk about next steps.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan and Mark and Dave and others at ERCOT for the hard work in putting this together and for giving us a look. I appreciate the task force and other stakeholder comments today. I took down a couple of areas where we need to do a little bit more work to determine if we have consensus, and I think Joel is going to convene a smaller group of folks in relatively short order to look and see where we can achieve that or where we can't. And then this is the first time so far in the couple of year history of the task force where we may not be able to achieve consensus. So we'll communicate what we're going to do in that situation. In the event that Joel is unsuccessful. No pressure, Joel. And I don't mean to exclude people from that discussion. So if you're super interested in joining that smaller group, please let Joel know by email or text, so that as he pulls it together, we can know who wants to participate. There may be a path forward there, at least on the 20% cap item. So we'll see if we can at least narrow down the areas where we don't have consensus. Joel, I don't know if you want to say anything. I was going to kind of bring this part of the discussion to a conclusion and use the remaining couple minutes just to talk about some of our other work that we need to do.
No, that sounds good, Jason. I think my starting point for the side discussion is the rep segment and the DER provider segment. So if you're outside of those segments and want to be a part of this like sidebar discussion, definitely let me know.
Thank you, Joel. And then we will, of course, keep ERCOT informed because we know that there's a timeline that we're working here. So I would ask for those folks that are going to be working with Joel to make every effort to try to accommodate a relatively soon meeting so that we can keep this ball rolling. With that, I think the final piece of work that we need to do as a task force is to respond back to Commissioner Glotfelty's memo from August of this year. We do have a working draft that I will get out to the task force. It will be informed a little bit by today's discussion, but we will get that over to the task force members hopefully here before Christmas. Appreciate Joel taking a first cut at putting some of the thoughts on paper that kind of summarizes our work over the last couple of months. And we will aim to get something on file with the commission in January. At this point, we won't make everyone work over the holidays for that. But I do want to start getting a draft in your hands so you can start thinking about the 4 items that he teed up in his memo. If we need to schedule a task force meeting to talk about those comments, we can certainly do that. But they may be high level and clear enough that we don't have to do that. So I'll take y'all's lead on that once you see the draft. But I did want to give you some insight into kind of the next piece of work that we need to wrap up as a group. With that, we've got a couple minutes left in our time period today. Since we typically have completely full agendas, I did want to, and we're at the end of a year almost, I did want to save a little bit of time to see if folks had thoughts that we should be thinking about for next steps, right? So our next step is to have the meeting that Joel's going to set up, kind of finalize our input to ERCOT, and then finalize our response to the Glockfelty memo. So those are the next steps. The next steps, obviously, this task force continues to serve a purpose, and we need to figure out where we want to go next. And so if anybody has any thoughts now to get the group thinking about, I'll stop talking. This is not going to be your only chance. And so if you want to think about it before providing that feedback, happy to do that too. But let me stop talking and see if anybody has any thoughts. Arushi.
So a little happy update. Carmen is maybe on the call. Is Carmen Best on there? But she and I are talking tomorrow to 2 of my student mentees. One is the president of the Harvard Undergraduate Energy Club, and the other one is at UT. They both have student-led consulting shops that are going to take the ADER Task Force on as their pro bono government client. So we will have the brains of at least 10 students across Harvard and UT to support us in the research segment on any of these topics, which frankly, we need manpower on. So it's really exciting. Carmen and I will be meeting with them tomorrow with an overview, and Carmen's done the work, and Jason, you and Joel know about this, but the rest of the task force may not, on the kind of like a research questions outline. Relatedly to that, their work will support us providing more accurate updates to national and academic labs that are using the ADER project as a model for scaling distributed energy advocacy and market design in other states. An example of that is the LBNL report, which should be published in the middle of January of next year. I'm not sure who else on the task force has talked to them, but I've just talked to Angela Long with Rockcrest Consulting, who is putting the ADER project in there, and she's got Dave Maggio's most recent update on the intended scope of the phase 3 of the governing document. So y'all are famous. And students want to help us. That's the upshot.
There you go. Thanks, Arushi, for organizing that. And if people want some good thinking by some smart people that are looking to accelerate the mission that we're all doing, please feel free to reach out to Arushi and she can loop you into that discussion. And thanks for the others that are participating in that as well. All right. We'll go ahead and bring today's discussion to a close then. And we will get going on our next steps. And again, want to thank our colleagues at ERCOT for putting this together so that we could look at it this year. And we will circle back with you all as soon as Joel completes his conversations and see if we can bring the entirety of today's discussion to a conclusion so y'all can move forward. So appreciate everybody's help today. Have a great holiday period. And sorry, I'm still not going to sing, but wish everyone a happy holiday season with your family. Hope you all get a good break, and we'll talk again in 2025. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks,
Thank
Jason.
you.
Make you
Thank
sing
you.
anyway later. D's and F's. Yeah, it's gonna have to.